Omar Al-Fayed was a man of unparalleled wealth and influence, the kind of figure whose name carried weight in every corner of the world. His sprawling Dubai mansion, a glittering palace of glass and gold, was a testament to his success. On any given evening, the mansion was alive with opulence, a symphony of laughter, the clink of crystal glasses, and the murmur of whispered deals. But tonight, the house was deathly silent. It was the maid who found him, slumped in his study chair, his hands still clutching the glass of his favorite single malt. The overhead chandelier cast a harsh light on his face, frozen in a grimace. His once commanding presence was now reduced to a chilling stillness. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. The official cause of death, as pronounced by the family doctor, was cardiac arrest. The news spread like wildfire. Omar Al-Fayed was dead at 58. The world reacted with shock, disbelief, and no small amount of curiosity. For a man whose every move was scrutinized, this sudden and quiet demise felt oddly incongruent. Rumors began to swirl. Layla Al-Fayed, Omar's widow, stood at the foot of the grand staircase, draped in a flowing black abaya. She was the picture of grief, her eyes swollen from tears. Yet beneath her veil of sorrow, there was an inscrutable stillness, a composure that unsettled those around her. At 32, Layla had been both a muse and a mystery, the subject of endless speculation. She had met Omar 5 years ago during a gala in Paris, and their whirlwind romance had been the stuff of tabloid fodder. Critics called her a gold digger, admirers called her a queen. But no one really knew her. Khalid Al-Fayed, Omar's younger brother, arrived shortly after the body was taken away. He stormed into the mansion with the air of a man both mourning and strategizing. Khalid had never been particularly close to his brother. Their relationship had always been complicated, a power struggle masquerading as sibling rivalry. Yet even Khalid seemed shaken as he approached Layla. "You should sit," he said curtly, but Layla shook her head. "I'll stand," she replied, her voice soft but firm. There was no warmth between them. Khalid's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, a mix of suspicion and something darker. The family lawyer, Yusuf Haddad, soon joined them, his briefcase in hand and his face a mask of professionalism. Yusuf had been Omar's confidant for years, the man who knew every detail of his vast empire. He offered a solemn nod to Khalid and Layla before getting straight to business. "We'll need to meet tomorrow to discuss the will," he said. Omar was very clear about how he wanted his affairs handled. Layla said nothing, but Khalid's jaw tightened. He had always assumed that Omar's empire, worth billions, would naturally fall to him. Layla, beautiful as she was, had no head for business, or so Khalid thought. The next day, the mansion was eerily quiet as the will was read in Omar's private study. The room was filled with the faint scent of cedar and leather, a testament to Omar's meticulous taste. Yusuf unfolded the document with deliberate care, his voice steady as he began to read. "To my beloved wife, Layla Al-Fayed," Yusuf intoned, "I leave the entirety of my estate, including all assets, properties, and shares of Al-Fayed Holdings." Khalid's eyes widened in disbelief. He leaned forward, his knuckles widening as he gripped the armrest of his chair. "This must be a mistake," Khalid said, his voice sharp. "There's no mistake," Yusuf replied calmly, though his gaze flickered to Layla, who sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't react, not visibly. Khalid stood abruptly, pacing the room. "He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't leave me with nothing." Yusuf adjusted his glasses, unfazed. Omar was very clear in his wishes. He wanted Layla to have full control of his estate. Layla finally spoke, her voice low but resolute. "This isn't the time for arguments, Khalid. Omar's gone. We need to honor his memory." "Honor?" Khalid spat, turning to her. "You've always had him wrapped around your finger. And now, even in death, you managed to take everything." Layla's expression didn't change. If his words affected her, she didn't show it. By the next morning, Layla was gone. The staff discovered her absence when they arrived to serve breakfast. Her room was empty, her belongings gone. The only trace she left was a single note on her bedside table. It read, "Forgive me." The media caught wind almost immediately. Headlines blared, speculating wildly about her sudden disappearance. "Widow on the run, what is Layla Al Fayed hiding?" "Secrets of the Al Fayed Empire, did Layla flee with Omar's fortune?" Rumors of foul play grew louder. Some whispered that Layla had poisoned Omar to claim his empire. Others suggested she had discovered something sinister and fled out of fear. Khalid was quick to seize the narrative. "She's hiding something," he told reporters. "I'll get to the bottom of this. Omar deserves justice." But Youssef was more measured. "Layla's departure is unfortunate," he told the press. "But we mustn't jump to conclusions. The investigation into Omar's death is ongoing, and we must let the authorities do their work." Behind closed doors, Youssef was less certain. Layla's sudden flight raised questions he couldn't ignore. Why had she left so abruptly? And more importantly, what had she taken with her? As the sun set over Dubai, Khalid stood on the balcony of his brother's mansion, gazing out at the city that never slept. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. Omar's death, the will, Layla's disappearance, it didn't add up. There was something he was missing, some piece of the puzzle that hadn't yet revealed itself. Inside the mansion, Youssef sat in Omar's study, poring over documents. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he came across a clause in the will he hadn't noticed before. "Interesting," he murmured to himself. Far away, in a city unknown, Layla stepped off a private jet. She glanced around the dimly lit tarmac before pulling her scarf tighter around her face. In her hand was a leather briefcase, its contents known only to her. The game was just beginning. Khalid sat in his office, the room dimly lit by the evening sun filtering through the blinds. A whiskey glass trembled in his hand as he stared at the stack of papers before him. The days since Layla's disappearance had been a blur of frustration and dead ends. Despite his efforts, no one could tell him where she had gone. His anger festered, fueled by the humiliation of being outmaneuvered yet again by the woman who now owned everything that should have been his. Determined not to let her slip away, Khalid hired a team of private investigators, sparing no expense. They began by scouring flight records, security footage, and bank transactions, piecing together a trail that hinted at her movements. The first breakthrough came when a private jet registered under one of Omar's shell companies was found to have landed in Paris the night Layla fled. From there, the chase began. Paris offered Khalid his first real lead. One investigator uncovered security footage of Layla at a high-end boutique in the city, her face partially obscured by sunglasses and a scarf. She had purchased a new phone, paid in cash, and disappeared again. But her brief presence left breadcrumbs. A taxi receipt carelessly discarded, leading Khalid's team to a hotel on the left bank. By the time they arrived, she was gone. Each discovery revealed more questions than answers. In her abandoned hotel room, Khalid found a photograph tucked into the bedside table. It was old and faded, depicting a younger Layla with a man he didn't recognize. On the back, a name was scrawled, Yasser. The name meant nothing to Khalid, but it gnawed at him. Who was Yasser, and what did he mean to Layla? From Paris, the trail led to Istanbul. Khalid followed reluctantly, hating the idea of chasing her like a lovesick fool but driven by a deeper need to know the truth. The investigators uncovered records of Layla renting a private boat at the Bosphorus port, heading toward the Prince's Islands. Khalid arrived the next morning, tension coursing through him as he walked the cobblestone streets of Bayukada. There, he found something unexpected, a quiet villa owned by an anonymous trust, the kind Omar often used to hide assets. It seemed Layla had been staying there briefly, but the house was already empty. The neighbors spoke of a beautiful woman who came and went quickly, leaving behind only whispers of her presence. Frustrated and exhausted, Khalid returned to the villa with the investigators, combing through every inch for clues. In a locked drawer, they found a folder containing forged documents, fake IDs, passports, and even a marriage certificate. The groom's name was Yasser Khalidi. Khalid stared at the certificate, rage simmering beneath his disbelief. Layla had been married before. She had lied to Omar, to everyone. But why? And where was Yasser now? As Khalid dug deeper into Layla's past, Yusuf was conducting his own investigation back in Dubai. He had grown suspicious after finding the peculiar clause in Omar's will, a clause that referred cryptically to contingency assets. The wording hinted at an offshore account, but access required biometric verification. It was a clever safeguard, one Omar had used before, but the implication was troubling. Omar had anticipated betrayal. Yusuf uncovered the existence of an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands tied to the clause, its holdings obscured through layers of legal obfuscation. His attempts to access the account were blocked without the necessary fingerprint. Frustrated, Yusuf realized Omar had created a vault not just of wealth but of secrets, one only he could unlock. Whatever Layla had taken or knew, it was clear Omar's death was not as straightforward as it seemed. Meanwhile, Khalid's search led him to Morocco. Layla had vanished once again, but not before withdrawing a substantial sum of money from an account in Istanbul. Investigators traced her movements to a remote village in the Rif Mountains, far from the bustling cities Khalid had expected. The location was baffling. Why would someone like Layla, accustomed to luxury, retreat to such isolation? Arriving in the village, Khalid felt out of place in his tailored suit and polished shoes. The dusty streets and modest homes were a far cry from the world he and Layla had shared. Yet, as he wandered the narrow alleys, he saw a flash of familiarity, a figure in a flowing scarf, walking briskly toward a small marketplace. It was her. Khalid followed, his heart pounding. When she entered a secluded courtyard, he confronted her. Layla turned, her eyes widening in shock before narrowing with defiance. "Khalid," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I didn't think you'd come this far. Did you think I'd let you run away with everything?" He spat. "You stole from Omar. From me. You think you can hide forever?" Layla laughed bitterly. "You think this is about money? You have no idea what's really going on." Khalid stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Then enlighten me. What was your plan? Poison Omar and take the empire for yourself?" Her expression darkened. "Omar's death wasn't my doing. But if you think he was an innocent victim, you're a fool. He wasn't the man you thought he was." Khalid hesitated, caught off guard by her tone. "What are you talking about?" Layla's eyes softened, but only slightly. "Omar was planning to destroy me. Everything we had, everything I thought we built together, it was a lie. He was using me as a pawn, and when I found out, I had to protect myself." "Protect yourself from what?" Khalid demanded. "What could he have done to you?" Layla stepped closer, lowering her voice. "He was faking his death, Khalid. The heart attack, the will, everything, it was part of his plan to disappear and leave me to take the fall. He had enemies closing in, debts he couldn't pay, and secrets too dangerous to reveal. I discovered it all too late. If I hadn't fled, I'd be dead by now." Khalid stared at her, his mind racing. The idea seemed preposterous, yet something in her voice, her expression, gave him pause. Could it be true? Had Omar staged his own death? Before Khalid could respond, a shadow fell over them. He turned, his stomach sinking as he saw two men approaching, their faces unfamiliar but their intentions clear. They carried themselves with the practiced ease of enforcers, the kind Omar had always kept on his payroll. Layla grabbed Khalid's arm, her voice urgent. "We need to leave. Now." Khalid hesitated only a moment before following her, the weight of her words pressing down on him. If what she said was true, he wasn't just chasing Layla anymore. He was chasing a ghost, one that might destroy them both. The dusty marketplace felt like a suffocating cage as Khalid and Layla sprinted through the narrow alleys, the footsteps of their pursuers echoing behind them. Layla clutched his arm, leading him through twists and turns with the confidence of someone who had studied every corner of this village. Khalid's lungs burned, his polished shoes slipping on the uneven ground, but her words from earlier still churned in his mind. Omar was alive. They finally burst into a hidden courtyard, breathless and momentarily alone. Layla pressed her back against the wall, her chest heaving. Khalid leaned forward, hands on his knees, struggling to catch his breath. You have 5 minutes, he managed, glaring at her. Explain everything. Start with the truth. Layla didn't hesitate. Omar faked his death. The heart attack was staged using a cocktail of drugs and a body double, someone he paid handsomely to disappear into obscurity. It was all part of his plan to escape his debts and enemies. His empire was crumbling, Khalid. He was on the verge of ruin. Khalid straightened, his expression incredulous. And you expect me to believe that he left you, his wife, in control of everything while he just vanished? She nodded, her voice steady. That's exactly what he wanted. He made it look like I inherited everything so his creditors and enemies would come after me instead of him. He left a trail of fake evidence to make it seem like I had been siphoning money from his accounts for years. When they came for me, they'd find nothing, and he'd be free to start over. Khalid stared at her, struggling to process the magnitude of her words. You're telling me he framed you? Yes, she said, her eyes blazing. And I almost fell for it. But I found out about his plan the night before he died. He underestimated me, Khalid. I've been playing his game ever since. Before Khalid could respond, a shadow moved in the corner of the courtyard. Both of them turned, tension crackling in the air. A man stepped forward, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. When he spoke, his voice was chillingly familiar. Well, this is a surprise. Omar Al-Fayed emerged from the shadows, alive and very much furious. His once polished demeanor was gone, replaced by a hardened edge. He looked leaner, rougher, as though he'd been living on the fringes of the world he once controlled. His eyes flicked between Khalid and Layla, sharp and calculating. Omar, Khalid breathed, his voice a mix of shock and anger. You're alive? Omar smirked, his hands in his pockets. Not for long if you two keep making noise like this. I didn't fake my death just to get caught in some backwater village. Layla stepped forward, her voice steady. It's over, Omar. You can't keep running. Omar's expression darkened. Over? You don't get to decide when it's over, Layla. You think you've outsmarted me, but you don't understand the game you're playing. He pulled a pistol from his jacket, pointing it at her. Khalid moved instinctively, stepping in front of her. Don't be stupid, Omar, Khalid said, his voice low. You're outnumbered, and you're running out of options. Omar laughed bitterly. Options? I've always had more options than you can imagine. But you too. He gestured at them with the gun. You're loose ends I need to tie up. Layla's voice cut through the tension. You're the one who underestimated me, Omar. Did you really think I'd just run without a plan? Omar hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps filled the courtyard. A team of men in suits and tactical gear poured in, weapons drawn. At their helm was Yusef, his face calm but resolute. Drop the gun, Omar, Yusef commanded. It's over. Omar's jaw tightened, his knuckles widening around the pistol. But he saw the futility of resistance. Slowly, he lowered the weapon and raised his hands. Layla stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. You thought you could manipulate me, destroy me, and vanish. But you forgot that I've been by your side long enough to know all your secrets. Omar glared at her, his voice dripping with venom. You've ruined everything. No, she said. I've taken back control. As the authorities led Omar away, Khalid turned to Layla, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion. You planned all of this? She nodded. I reached out to Yusef the moment I fled Dubai. I knew he'd be loyal to Omar's legacy, not to Omar's lies. Together, we gathered the evidence to expose him. Every move I made, every risk I took, it was to get to this moment. Khalid shook his head, still grappling with the enormity of what had just unfolded. Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped. Layla met his gaze, her expression softening. Would you have believed me? You hated me, Khalid. You thought I was just another pretty face who stole what you thought was yours. He didn't deny it, but there was no malice in his eyes now. Instead, there was something else, respect. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Omar's capture rippled through the world. His empire was dismantled piece by piece, his crimes laid bare for all to see. Fraud, embezzlement, and connections to organized crime, it was a scandal that shook the business world to its core. Layla emerged from the chaos not as a victim, but as a survivor. She used her share of Omar's wealth to establish a foundation dedicated to helping women escape abusive and manipulative relationships, a cause close to her heart. The media painted her as a phoenix rising from the ashes of a toxic marriage, a narrative she neither confirmed nor denied. Khalid, for his part, stepped into the role he had always coveted. With Omar gone, he became the head of the family empire, determined to rebuild it with integrity. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a chance to carve out his own legacy. As for Omar, his attempts to negotiate a deal fell on deaf ears. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, a king without a kingdom. On a quiet evening in Morocco, Layla sat on the balcony of a modest villa, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She sipped her tea, savoring the peace she had fought so hard to achieve. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Khalid, his expression lighter than she'd ever seen it. "Still hiding out?" he teased, taking a seat beside her. She smiled faintly. "Not hiding. Just enjoying the quiet." He studied her for a moment. "You did well, Layla. Better than I ever expected." She tilted her head, her eyes meeting his. "And you've surprised me too. Maybe there's hope for us after all." Khalid chuckled. "Maybe there is." For the first time, there was no tension between them, no rivalry or suspicion, only the beginnings of something new. Together, they sat in silence, letting the past fade into the distance as the future stretched out before them. A billionaire CEO seeking solace in a small coastal town falls in love with a poor, working-class single mother. But when he tries to merge their worlds together, chaos ensues. Jason Turner stared out the window of his sleek black SUV as it wound its way along the narrow coastal road. The ocean stretched endlessly to his right, waves crashing rhythmically against the jagged rocks. The small beach town of Seabreeze Bay, nestled in a crescent-shaped cove, came into view. It was nothing like the bustling cityscape he had left behind. The towering glass buildings and suffocating boardrooms had been replaced by pastel cottages, a single main street, and the smell of salt water in the air. He had chosen this place deliberately, remote, quiet, unassuming. Seabreeze Bay wasn't the kind of town that cared about the latest Forbes list or the scandals plastered across financial news sites. Here, he could fade into anonymity, at least for a while. Jason needed the escape. His life had become a relentless cycle of meetings, deals, and damage control, and the recent scandal involving his company had been the tipping point. The media frenzy had been merciless, and though the worst of it had been contained, his name was still on everyone's lips. The SUV pulled into the parking lot of the Sandpiper Inn, the town's modest but charming bed and breakfast. Jason stepped out, his tailored suit and polished shoes immediately out of place among the locals in flip-flops and sundresses. The innkeeper, a sprightly woman in her 60s, greeted him warmly, handing him a brass key and offering a few recommendations for places to visit. One of those recommendations was Dahlia's Cafe. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a small clapboard building painted a fading blue with flower boxes beneath the windows. The sign above the door was hand-painted and slightly crooked, but there was an inviting quality about it. Inside, the cafe smelled of freshly brewed coffee, baked goods, and a hint of sea breeze that wafted through the open windows. Jason stepped inside, and his presence drew a few curious glances. He was used to being noticed, but this was different. There was no recognition in their eyes, only mild curiosity about the stranger who didn't quite belong. Behind the counter, a woman was stacking plates and chatting with a customer. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she wore a simple apron over a sundress. She looked up as the door jingled and offered Jason a smile that was warm and genuine. "Welcome! Take a seat wherever you like," she said, her voice carrying an effortless cheer. Jason chose a corner table by the window, trying to blend into the background. A few moments later, the woman approached, holding a notepad and pen. "First time here?" she asked. He nodded. "Just got into town. Vacation or hiding from the world?" she asked lightly, her tone teasing but not prying. Jason allowed a faint smile. "A little of both." "Well, you've come to the right place," she said. "I'm Dahlia, by the way." "Jason," he replied. Her eyes flickered to his crisp shirt and expensive watch, but she didn't comment. Instead, she handed him a menu and recommended the clam chowder, saying it was made fresh that morning. He took her suggestion, and she returned a few minutes later with a steaming bowl and a slice of crusty bread. As Jason ate, he watched Dahlia move around the cafe. She was constantly in motion, refilling coffee cups, chatting with customers, and wiping down tables. Despite the busyness, she radiated an ease and warmth that seemed to put everyone at ease. It was a stark contrast to the people in his world, where every interaction was calculated and transactional. The food was simple but good, and the cafe had a comforting, unpretentious atmosphere that made Jason linger longer than he intended. Dahlia noticed. "Still hungry, or just enjoying the view?" she asked with a grin as she cleared his empty bowl. "Both," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. She laughed, a sound that was light and melodic. "Careful, or I'll start charging you rent for the table." He left the cafe that day feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, lightness. Over the next few days, he found himself returning to Dahlia's cafe, drawn by more than just the food. It was Dahlia herself who kept pulling him back. She had a way of talking that made him forget who he was supposed to be. They spoke about everything and nothing, her son, Noah, who was 8 and obsessed with pirate stories, the weather, the challenges of running a small business. She never asked about him, about his life or his work, and he found that refreshing. For her part, Dahlia noticed the quiet sadness in Jason's eyes, the way he seemed both out of place and desperate to belong. She didn't press him for details, sensing that he was here to escape something. Still, there was something about him that intrigued her. He wasn't like the tourists who passed through town every summer. There was a depth to him, a complexity that hinted at a life far removed from her own. One evening, as the cafe was winding down, Jason stayed behind to help Dahlia stack chairs and wipe tables. She protested at first, saying he didn't need to, but he insisted. "You don't strike me as the type who's used to manual labor," she teased. "There's a first time for everything," he replied, his tone light but his expression sincere. As they worked side by side, their conversation grew more personal. Dahlia told him about her late husband, who had died in a fishing accident when Noah was a baby. She spoke of the struggles of raising a child on her own, of keeping the cafe afloat, and of the joy she found in small, simple moments. Jason listened intently, feeling a pang of guilt for how disconnected his own life had become. He couldn't remember the last time he had a conversation like this, one without an agenda or ulterior motive. When they finished, Dahlia walked him to the door. The sky outside was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that made the world feel a little softer. "Thank you for your help," she said. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," he replied. For a moment, they stood there in the golden light, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Dahlia smiled, the same warm, genuine smile that had greeted him on his first day. "Good night, Jason." "Good night, Dahlia." As he walked back to the Sandpiper Inn, Jason realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his company, his reputation, or the scandal that had driven him here. Instead, he was thinking about a woman in a seaside cafe and the way her laughter had made him feel human again. Jason found himself settling into a routine he hadn't anticipated. Every morning, he would walk the short distance from the Sandpiper Inn to Dahlia's cafe, where she greeted him with a smile and a steaming cup of coffee. What started as polite conversation had deepened into something more personal. Days turned into weeks, and the line between casual acquaintance and meaningful connection blurred. Dahlia, despite her reservations, had grown used to his presence. He wasn't like the tourists who breezed through town, eager for photo ops and souvenirs. Jason stayed longer, listened more intently, and asked questions that revealed an earnestness she hadn't expected from someone who clearly came from a different world. One quiet afternoon, when the cafe was unusually empty, Dahlia wiped her hands on her apron and slid into the chair across from him. Jason looked up from the book he was pretending to read, startled but pleased by her presence. "You've been coming here for weeks," she began, her tone teasing but curious. "Don't you have someplace more exciting to be?" Jason set the book aside, leaning forward slightly. "This is exciting enough for me." Dahlia laughed softly, shaking her head. "I doubt that. A man like you probably thrives on excitement. This town must be boring you to tears." "I wouldn't say that," he replied. "I've had more meaningful conversations in this cafe than I've had in years." Dahlia's smile faltered, and for a moment she looked down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "It's not always like this, you know. Running this place, it's a constant struggle. Some days I wonder if it's even worth it." Jason's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "The bills pile up faster than I can pay them. Repairs, rent, supplies, it's never ending. I keep going because of Noah. I want him to have something stable, a place he can be proud of. But there are days when I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle." There was a vulnerability in her voice that made Jason's chest tighten. He wanted to offer solutions, to write a check or make a call that would ease her burden, but he knew better. Dahlia wasn't the type to accept help easily, especially from someone like him. "I'm sorry you're going through that," he said instead. "You're doing more than most would. Noah's lucky to have you." Dahlia smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "I just want him to have a better life. I don't want him to feel stuck here the way I sometimes do." Jason nodded, understanding more than he let on. "I think I know what you mean." She tilted her head, studying him. "You? Stuck? You don't strike me as someone who lets anything hold him back." Jason hesitated. "You'd be surprised. My world, it's not as glamorous as it seems. People always want something from you, and after a while, you start to wonder if anyone actually sees you for who you are. It's exhausting." Dahlia's eyes softened with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. "That sounds lonely." "It is," he admitted. "That's why I came here. I needed to get away, to remember what it feels like to be normal." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared confessions lingering between them. Then Dahlia reached across the table and rested her hand lightly on his. "You're not as bad at being normal as you think," she said with a small smile. The moment was brief, but it left a mark on both of them. After that day, their conversations grew deeper. Jason learned about Dahlia's late husband, the love they had shared, and the hole his loss had left in her life. Dahlia, in turn, learned about Jason's rise to success, the sacrifices he had made, and the emptiness that success had left behind. But not everyone in Seabreeze Bay was as taken with Jason as Dahlia was. The locals watched him with suspicion, their whispers growing louder the longer he stayed. To them, he was an outsider who didn't belong, a man who couldn't possibly understand the struggles of their small-town life. Dahlia heard their murmurs, saw the way their glances lingered when she spoke to him. It made her question her own judgment, wondering if she was letting herself be blinded by his charm. One evening, Jason and Dahlia closed the cafe together, their movements synchronized after weeks of working side by side. As they stepped outside, the cool night air greeted them, carrying the scent of the ocean. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the beach. "Walk with me?" Jason asked, his voice soft but inviting. Dahlia hesitated for only a moment before nodding. They walked in silence at first, the sound of the waves their only companion. Jason slipped off his shoes, carrying them in one hand as his feet sank into the damp sand. Dahlia followed suit, laughing softly at the unexpected freedom of it. They stopped near the water's edge, the tide lapping at their toes. Dahlia hugged her arms to herself, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to leave this place," she said quietly. "To see the world beyond this little town." "You could," Jason said, turning to face her. You're stronger than you realize. Dahlia shook her head, her expression tinged with both longing and resignation. It's not that simple. This place is all I've ever known. And Noah, he needs stability. Jason stepped closer, his voice low and earnest. You deserve more than just surviving, Dahlia. You deserve to dream. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. She looked away, her cheeks warming. And what about you? What do you dream of? Jason hesitated, his gaze dropping to the sand. I don't know anymore. For so long, I thought I had everything I wanted. But now, I'm not sure any of it matters. Dahlia reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. Maybe you just need to figure out what does. They stood there for a moment, the distance between them narrowing. The moonlight caught the glint of tears in Dahlia's eyes, but she blinked them away, stepping back. We should get back, she said, her voice steady but her heart pounding. Jason nodded, his expression unreadable. They walked back in silence, the tension between them palpable but unspoken. When they reached the cafe, Dahlia unlocked the door and turned to face him. Good night, Jason, she said softly. Good night, Dahlia. As he watched her disappear inside, Jason felt a pang of longing he hadn't expected. He wanted to know more about her, to be a part of her world, even if it meant confronting the growing doubts in his own. But as he walked back to the Sandpiper Inn, he couldn't shake the feeling that their connection, as real as it felt, was fragile, like a sandcastle too close to the tide. The days following their moonlit walk were both comforting and complicated for Jason and Dahlia. They found themselves falling into a rhythm, but the growing closeness also brought with it an undercurrent of unspoken tension. Dahlia was used to keeping people at arm's length, and Jason was finding it harder to balance his instincts as a problem solver with the respect he was learning to show for her boundaries. One afternoon, as Dahlia wiped down tables after the lunch rush, Jason lingered at his usual corner seat. He noticed the strain on her face lately, the way she seemed to be carrying a heavier burden than usual. Her smile was still there, but it was thinner, more forced. You seem tired, Jason said, watching her closely. Dahlia paused, leaning against the counter. Just a lot on my plate. It's nothing I can't handle. He frowned, unconvinced. What if it's something you don't have to handle alone? Dahlia gave him a pointed look, the kind she'd started to use when she wanted to set boundaries without saying the words outright. I appreciate the concern, Jason, but I've been managing just fine. Jason nodded, not wanting to push, but the conversation stayed with him long after he left the cafe. That evening, back at the Sandpiper Inn, he made a decision. He wasn't the kind of man to sit idly by when he had the resources to help someone in need. And Dahlia needed help, even if she was too proud to ask for it. The next morning, Dahlia walked into her cafe to find an envelope tucked beneath the register. Inside was a check that more than covered the debts she'd been losing sleep over. For a moment, she stared at the piece of paper, her mind racing. There was no note, no signature, but she didn't need one. Only one person knew enough about her struggles to do something like this. When Jason arrived later that day, his usual confident stride faltered the moment he saw Dahlia's expression. She was waiting for him, the check in her hand. Care to explain this? She asked, her voice steady but her eyes sharp. Jason hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. I just wanted to help. Dahlia shook her head, her grip on the check tightening. Help? By going behind my back? By throwing money at a problem you don't even fully understand? I didn't mean to offend you, Jason said, his tone apologetic. I know how much you're struggling, and I thought, that's just it, Jason. She interrupted, her voice rising. You thought. You didn't ask. You didn't give me a chance to decide for myself. The cafe was empty, but the confrontation felt as public as if they'd been on the main street. Jason looked around, as though the walls themselves might offer some sort of guidance, but they didn't. He took a step closer to Dahlia, lowering his voice. I didn't want to see you lose this place, he said. It means so much to you, and to Noah. I thought. I thought I was doing the right thing. Dahlia let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. The right thing? Do you even understand what this place is to me? It's not just a business, Jason. It's my independence. My chance to prove to myself, and to my son, that we can make it on our own. And you just swept in like some kind of savior, thinking your money could fix everything. Jason felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his chest. She wasn't wrong. In his world, problems were often solved with money, with influence. He hadn't stopped to consider how that might feel to someone like Dahlia, who had built her life on resilience and self-reliance. I'm sorry, he said, his voice earnest. I overstepped. I wasn't trying to take anything away from you. I just wanted to make things easier. Dahlia's shoulders sagged, some of her anger giving way to exhaustion. I know you meant well, but you can't just throw money at people's lives and expect it to fix things. That's not how it works. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken feelings. Then Dahlia took a deep breath and handed the check back to him. I can't accept this, she said firmly. If I'm going to keep this place running, it has to be because I earned it. Not because someone swooped in and saved me. Jason nodded, tucking the check back into his pocket. I understand. And I'm sorry. I won't do anything like that again. Dahlia studied him for a moment, searching his face for signs of sincerity. When she found it, she nodded, the tension between them easing slightly. I appreciate the thought, she said, her tone softer. But if you really want to help, just be here. Be a friend. Jason smiled faintly, relief washing over him. I can do that. The following days were quieter between them, the aftermath of their confrontation lingering in the unspoken pauses of their conversations. But something had shifted. Jason, humbled by Dahlia's words, began to see her struggles through a different lens. He stopped trying to solve her problems and started simply listening. And Dahlia, despite her lingering doubts, found herself trusting him a little more. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jason sat on the cafe's porch with Dahlia. They watched as Noah played on the beach, his laughter carried on the breeze. Thank you, Dahlia said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Jason glanced at her, surprised. For what? For understanding, she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. For not pushing. I know you're trying, and I appreciate it. Jason's lips curved into a small smile. I'm learning. You're a good teacher. Dahlia laughed softly, shaking her head. I'm not sure about that, but I'm glad you're here. Jason felt a warmth spread through him at her words. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Like he was more than just his name, his wealth, or his reputation. And as they sat there, watching the waves roll in, he knew he was willing to do whatever it took to keep earning her trust. The days after their confrontation marked a turning point in Jason and Dahlia's growing bond. While the tension between them had settled, something deeper had begun to bloom in its place. Jason showed a quiet determination to respect Dahlia's boundaries, and Dahlia, in turn, found herself softening toward the man who was learning, step by step, how to meet her where she was. It was Dahlia who first extended the olive branch of trust. One morning, as Jason lingered in his usual corner seat, she approached him with an unexpected proposition. What are you doing this afternoon? She asked, a playful smile tugging at her lips. Jason looked up from the book he had been pretending to read. That depends. Do I need to be worried? Dahlia laughed, leaning her hip against the table. Not unless you're afraid of a little hard work. I could use an extra set of hands in the cafe today. I thought maybe you'd want to help out. Jason's eyebrows lifted in surprise. You want me to work here? Why not? She said with a shrug. Consider it a crash course in normal life. Unless you think you can't handle it. There was a teasing glint in her eyes, and Jason couldn't help but smile. Challenge accepted. That afternoon, Jason found himself behind the counter, taking orders, carrying plates, and even attempting to work the coffee machine. His polished exterior clashed hilariously with the casual chaos of the cafe, but he embraced it with surprising enthusiasm. Dahlia watched him from the corner of her eye, amused by the way he fumbled but also touched by his effort. Noah stopped by after school, bounding into the cafe with the boundless energy of an 8-year-old. Dahlia introduced him to Jason, who crouched down to meet the boy's eyes. "You're the guy who keeps drinking all the coffee," Noah said matter-of-factly, his arms crossed. Genuinely amused, Jason chuckled. "Guilty as charged." Noah eyed him critically for a moment, then grinned. "Well, if you're going to hang around, you better know how to make a good grilled cheese. Mom says mine are the best." Jason raised his hands in surrender. "Looks like I've got some competition." From that day on, Noah became a frequent presence in Jason's life. The boy's unfiltered honesty and infectious enthusiasm were a stark contrast to the carefully curated interactions Jason was used to. He found himself drawn into Noah's world, whether it was listening to his tales of pirate adventures or helping him build sandcastles on the beach. One evening, Dahlia invited Jason to join them at the town's annual seaside festival. The event was the highlight of the year, with food stalls, live music, and a small carnival set up along the shoreline. Jason hesitated at first, unsure if he would fit in, but Dahlia's quiet encouragement gave him the push he needed. The festival was unlike anything Jason had ever experienced. The air buzzed with laughter, and the scent of salt water mingled with the aroma of funnel cakes and grilled seafood. Dahlia guided him through the stalls, introducing him to neighbors and friends who eyed him with a mix of curiosity and lingering skepticism. As the evening wore on, they found themselves in the middle of the festival square, illuminated by the glow of string lights and the soft hum of a local band. Noah had run off to join a group of kids, leaving Jason and Dahlia alone. Dahlia turned to him, her eyes sparkling. "So, what do you think? Too quaint for your taste?" Jason shook his head, his smile genuine. "Not at all. I think I needed this more than I realized." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the band began to play a slower tune. Around them, couples drifted onto the makeshift dance floor. Jason glanced at Dahlia, a nervous energy stirring within him. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Dahlia hesitated, but then she smiled, taking his hand. "Why not?" They stepped onto the dance floor, moving tentatively at first. Jason's hand rested lightly on her waist, and Dahlia's fingers grazed his shoulder. The rhythm of the music guided them, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. "You're surprisingly good at this," Dahlia said, tilting her head to look up at him. "I've had practice," Jason admitted. "But never like this." Dahlia's smile softened, and she searched his eyes, as if looking for something hidden beneath the surface. "You're full of surprises, Jason Turner. And you make me want to keep surprising you," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Dahlia's breath caught, and the space between them seemed to shrink. For a moment, it felt as though time had paused, the only sound the soft strains of the music and the distant crash of the waves. "I don't know what this is," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the music. "But it scares me." Jason's hand tightened gently on hers. "It scares me too. But maybe that's a good thing." Dahlia searched his face, her heart pounding. She had been so careful, so guarded, but Jason was unraveling her defenses piece by piece. And though every instinct told her to step back, to protect herself, she found she didn't want to. "I don't want to get hurt," she admitted, her voice trembling. Jason's expression softened, and he leaned in slightly, his gaze steady. "Neither do I. But I think this, whatever this is worth the risk." The song ended, and the moment hung in the air between them. Dahlia exhaled, stepping back slightly, though her hand lingered in his. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice wavering. "You don't have to decide now," Jason said gently. "Let's take it one step at a time." Dahlia nodded, her heart still racing. As they left the dance floor and rejoined the bustling crowd, the air between them was charged with unspoken possibilities. It wasn't a perfect beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless, a tentative step towards something neither of them fully understood but couldn't ignore. Later that night, as Jason walked back to the Sandpiper Inn, he couldn't help but replay the moment in his mind. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was stepping into uncharted territory. Dahlia, meanwhile, sat on the porch of her cafe, staring out at the moonlit waves. Her heart was still caught between fear and hope, but a small, undeniable part of her wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, Jason was someone worth taking a chance on. The festival lingered in Dahlia's mind like a dream she couldn't quite let go of. The way Jason had held her, his words, the warmth in his eyes, it all felt like a promise of something real, something she hadn't dared hope for in a long time. Yet, as the days passed, reality began to creep in, nudging her back toward the guardedness that had protected her for so long. Jason seemed different, too. He was still present, still kind, but there was an edge to him now, a subtle tension she couldn't ignore. It wasn't until the sleek black car pulled up outside the cafe one crisp morning that Dahlia began to understand why. A sharply dressed woman stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached the cafe. She was beautiful and polished, the kind of person who seemed more at home in a skyscraper than a small-town diner. Dahlia felt her stomach tighten as the woman opened the door, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on Jason. "Mr. Turner," she said, her tone brisk but professional. "I've been trying to reach you." Jason, who had been sitting at his usual table, looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and resignation. "Rachel," he said, standing. "What are you doing here?" "Damage control," she replied, glancing briefly at Dahlia before turning her attention back to Jason. "We need to talk. Now." The exchange was brief, but it left a chill in its wake. Jason shot Dahlia an apologetic look before following Rachel outside, leaving her standing behind the counter with a sinking feeling in her chest. When Jason returned later that day, he looked troubled. Dahlia didn't press him at first, sensing that he was grappling with something. But as the evening wore on and he remained unusually quiet, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Who was she?" Dahlia asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Jason hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "My assistant. She came to remind me of some things I've been avoiding." Dahlia raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" He sighed, leaning against the counter. "My company. My responsibilities. There's a board meeting next week, and they're expecting me to be there. Rachel thinks my absence is starting to look bad." Dahlia's heart sank. She had known, on some level, that Jason's life outside of Seabreeze Bay would catch up to him eventually. But hearing it spoken aloud made it feel all too real. "And what do you think?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Jason looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know. Being here, it's changed me. I don't want to go back to the way things were. But it's not that simple." Dahlia nodded, forcing a small smile. "It never is." The following week was a blur of uncertainty. Jason spent more time on the phone, his voice low and serious as he spoke to people from his old world. Dahlia watched from a distance, feeling the gap between them widen with each passing day. Then, one morning, everything changed. The cafe was busier than usual, the chatter of customers filling the air, when Dahlia's phone buzzed with an alert. She glanced at the screen and froze. A headline stared back at her, accompanied by a photo of her and Jason at the festival. "Billionaire CEO spotted with mystery woman in seaside escape." Her stomach turned as she scrolled through the article, each word cutting deeper. It painted her as a nobody, a small-town woman who had managed to catch the eye of a powerful man. The tone was condescending, almost mocking, and it left her feeling exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. By the time Jason arrived at the cafe that afternoon, Dahlia was seething. "Did you know about this?" she demanded, thrusting her phone toward him. Jason's face fell as he read the article. "Dahlia, Don't," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "Don't tell me you didn't see this coming. You knew who you were, Jason. You knew what kind of attention this would bring." "I didn't think it would happen like this," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I tried to keep things private. Dahlia laughed bitterly. There's nothing private about your world. And now I'm being dragged into it, whether I like it or not. Jason reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Dahlia, please. I never wanted this to happen. I care about you, about us. We can figure this out together. She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't know if I can, Jason. I've worked so hard to build a life for myself and Noah, and now it feels like it's all unraveling because of you. The words stung, but Jason knew they weren't entirely untrue. His presence in Dahlia's life had brought complications she hadn't asked for, and he hated himself for it. The next few days were tense. Dahlia tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the whispers from the townspeople and the relentless calls from reporters made it impossible. Even Noah picked up on the change, asking why his mom seemed so upset all the time. Jason, meanwhile, found himself torn between two worlds. Rachel had made it clear that his absence was unsustainable, and the media attention only added fuel to the fire. But the thought of leaving Dahlia and Noah felt unbearable. One evening, he showed up at the cafe after closing, his expression determined. I'm not going back, he said, the words spilling out before Dahlia could even greet him. She stared at him, her emotions a storm of anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. Jason, you can't just, I've been thinking about this for days, he interrupted, his voice firm. And I know it's not fair to ask you to keep putting up with this. But I also know that I don't want to lose you. Dahlia crossed her arms, her heart pounding. And what about your company? Your responsibilities? I'll figure it out, he said, stepping closer. But I'm done letting that world control me. You and Noah, you've shown me what really matters. And I'm not willing to give that up. For a moment, Dahlia didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to believe him, to trust that he meant every word. But another part of her was still raw from the backlash, still doubting whether their lives could ever truly fit together. You can't fix this with words, Jason, she said finally, her voice steady but soft. I need to know that you mean it. That you're willing to fight for this, for us. Jason nodded, his eyes unwavering. I'll prove it to you, Dahlia. Whatever it takes. As he left the cafe that night, Dahlia watched him go, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She wanted to believe in him, in the possibility of a future together. But the path ahead felt more uncertain than ever, and she wasn't sure if either of them was truly ready for what lay ahead. The days that followed Jason's dedaliation were a delicate dance of uncertainty. Dahlia found herself caught between the growing weight of public scrutiny and her own unresolved feelings for Jason. Despite his promise to prove his commitment, the reality of their situation felt insurmountable. The whispers in town grew louder, the headlines more invasive, and Dahlia began to feel like a character in someone else's story, a story where she didn't belong. Jason, for his part, was trying to navigate the storm that had overtaken both their lives. He called in favors, worked to suppress the media frenzy, and made every effort to shield Dahlia and Noah from the fallout. But no matter how much he tried, the gap between them seemed to widen with each passing day. Dahlia had grown quieter, her once open demeanor replaced by a guardedness that felt like a wall he couldn't break through. One evening, after the cafe had closed and the streets of Seabreeze Bay had fallen silent, Dahlia sat on the porch, staring out at the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore in a soothing rhythm, but her mind was anything but calm. She heard Jason's footsteps before she saw him, the sound of gravel crunching under his shoes as he approached. "You're still up," he said, his voice tentative. Dahlia didn't look at him. "Couldn't sleep." Jason sat down beside her, leaving a careful distance between them. For a moment, they sat in silence, the tension between them palpable. "Dahlia," he began, "I know things have been hard lately. I wish I could, I'm not sure I can do this, Jason," she interrupted, her voice heavy with emotion. He turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Do what?" "This," she said, gesturing vaguely between them. "Us. Your life, your world, it's too much. I didn't sign up for this, and I don't think I can handle it." Jason's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're not ruining anything. If anyone's to blame, it's me. I brought you into this mess. And that's the problem, she said, finally looking at him. Your world, your choices, they have consequences that I can't escape. People are judging me, questioning everything about me, about Noah. It's exhausting, Jason. And it's not fair to him. Jason rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of her words sinking in. I know it's not fair. I've been trying to fix it, to protect you both. You can't protect us from this, Dahlia said, her voice rising. You don't understand what it's like to feel so exposed, so powerless. Every time I step outside, I feel like people are staring at me, whispering about me. I didn't ask for this, Jason. Jason's frustration bubbled to the surface, and he stood, pacing the porch. You think I don't know how that feels? My entire life has been under a microscope since the day I took over my company. I've spent years trying to prove I'm more than a headline, more than the expectations people have for me. But you chose that life. Dahlia shot back, rising to face him. You chose to be in the spotlight, to live with that pressure. I didn't. And I can't keep pretending that I can handle it. Jason stopped, his hands clenched at his sides. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I don't lie awake at night wondering how to make this work? I'm terrified, Dahlia. Terrified of losing you, of losing what we've started. But I don't know how to fix this. Dahlia's anger wavered, replaced by a deep sadness. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the raw vulnerability he rarely showed. But it wasn't enough to quiet the doubts in her heart. I'm scared too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But love isn't enough to make this work, Jason. It takes more than that. And I don't know if we have what it takes. Jason stepped closer, his voice desperate. We can figure it out. Together. Don't give up on us, Dahlia. She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. I'm not giving up. I'm trying to protect myself, and Noah. I have to think about what's best for him. The mention of Noah hit Jason like a punch to the gut. He took a step back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I don't know what to say. Maybe there's nothing left to say, Dahlia said, her voice trembling. Maybe this is where we have to let go. Jason stared at her, his heart breaking. He wanted to fight, to convince her that they could overcome this, but he could see the resolve in her eyes. She had made up her mind. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dahlia reached out, her hand brushing his. And I don't want to lose myself. The words hung in the air between them, a painful truth neither could deny. Jason nodded slowly, his throat tight. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night. Dahlia stood on the porch long after he had gone, the sound of the waves a cruel reminder of the calm she no longer felt. She had thought letting him go would bring her peace, but instead, it left an ache in her chest she didn't know how to soothe. As she watched the moonlight dance on the water, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just let go of something precious, something that might never come again. The days after Jason walked away were hollow and quiet. Dahlia poured herself into the cafe, focusing on her work and Noah, but the absence of Jason lingered like a shadow. She told herself it was for the best, that she was protecting her son and herself, but the ache in her chest said otherwise. Still, the noise around their brief relationship persisted, online articles speculating about her motives, customers whispering behind her back, and the relentless feeling of being watched. Jason, meanwhile, had returned to his world, but it felt emptier than ever. The city skyline that once inspired ambition now felt cold and unwelcoming. Meetings and calls filled his days, but his thoughts always drifted back to Dahlia and Noah, to the life he'd begun to imagine with them. The pain of losing Dahlia was unbearable, but what haunted him more was the knowledge that he hadn't fought hard enough for her. It was Rachel who finally pushed him toward clarity. She found him one afternoon in his office, staring blankly out the window. You look terrible, she said bluntly, setting a coffee on his desk. Thanks, Jason muttered, not bothering to look at her. Rachel sighed, sitting across from him. Look, I don't usually get involved in your personal life, but it's obvious this thing with Dahlia has you spiraling. What are you going to do about it? Jason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I don't know what I can do. She's made up her mind. Has she? Or did you just let her think there was no other way? Rachel asked, her tone sharp. You've spent your whole life solving problems, Jason. Why stop now? If she's worth it, and I think she is, then fight for her. Her words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time in weeks, Jason felt a flicker of purpose. He couldn't let fear or pride hold him back any longer. Dahlia deserved more than quiet gestures and half-hearted promises. She deserved to know how much she meant to him, no matter the cost. 2 days later, Jason sat across from a journalist in a sleek, modern studio. The interview had been arranged weeks ago to discuss his company's plans, but Jason had decided to take it in a different direction. The bright lights and cameras didn't intimidate him. What scared him was the vulnerability of what he was about to do. The interviewer smiled warmly. Jason, your absence from the corporate spotlight has raised some questions. What's been going on? Jason took a deep breath. I needed time to reflect. My life has been defined by success and ambition, but recently I realized that those things don't matter if they come at the expense of what's real. The interviewer raised an eyebrow, intrigued. That's quite a statement. Can you elaborate? Jason nodded, his voice steady but earnest. I met someone. Someone who showed me what it means to live a life filled with purpose and connection. Her name is Dahlia, and she runs a small cafe in Seabreeze Bay. She and her son changed the way I see the world. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jason leaned forward, his gaze direct. She's been unfairly judged and scrutinized because of who I am, and I take full responsibility for that. But let me be clear, Dahlia is the strongest, most genuine person I've ever met. She's not defined by the superficial values that dominate my world, and that's why I love her. She taught me that real success isn't measured by wealth or power but by the relationships we build and the lives we touch. The interviewer was visibly moved. That's incredibly personal to share. What do you hope to accomplish with this message? I hope to set the record straight, Jason said firmly. Dahlia doesn't need my wealth or status. She's built a beautiful life on her own. If people want to judge, they can judge me, not her. And I hope she knows that I'll spend the rest of my life proving how much she means to me, if she'll let me. The interview aired that evening, and it quickly went viral. Social media lit up with reactions, ranging from admiration to skepticism. But amid the chaos, the sincerity of Jason's words shone through. For every critic, there were dozens of voices rallying behind him, praising his honesty and vulnerability. Dahlia heard about the interview from a customer, who gushed about Jason's heartfelt dedication. Skeptical but curious, she found the video online and watched it in the quiet of her living room after Noah had gone to bed. As Jason's words played out on the screen, she felt a wave of emotions, shock, anger, and most of all, an overwhelming sense of love. The next morning, Dahlia found herself pacing the beach, the salty air calming her as she sorted through her thoughts. Jason's gesture was bold, risky, and completely unexpected. But it was also a reminder of the man she had fallen for, the man who had shown her kindness, who had embraced her world despite its simplicity, and who had been willing to stand by her even when it wasn't easy. By the time the sun rose higher in the sky, Dahlia had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her choices anymore. Later that day, Jason stood at the edge of the cafe's porch, his heart pounding as Dahlia stepped outside to meet him. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, he feared the worst. I saw your interview, she said, her voice steady. Jason nodded, his throat tight. I meant every word. Dahlia's lips curved into a small smile, her eyes softening. You're brave, Jason. And maybe a little crazy. But you made me realize something. What's that? He asked, hope flickering in his chest. That I've been scared, she admitted. Scared of losing myself, of getting hurt, of what this could mean for Noah. But the truth is, I've been pushing you away because I thought it was easier than letting you in. And I don't want to do that anymore. Jason stepped closer, his heart pounding. Does that mean? It means I love you too, Dahlia said, her voice trembling with emotion. But if we're going to make this work, it has to be on our terms. No headlines, no grand gestures, just us, figuring it out together. Jason smiled, relief washing over him. I can do that. Whatever it takes, I'm all in. Dahlia reached for his hand, and he held it tightly, the connection between them stronger than ever. They stood there on the porch, the world around them fading into the background. For the first time, their love felt like something they could truly build a future on, not perfect, not easy, but real. And for both of them, that was enough. The weeks that followed were a time of transition, a delicate balancing act as Jason and Dahlia worked to blend their worlds. True to his word, Jason took deliberate steps to simplify his life, starting with a decision that shocked his colleagues and made headlines. He announced he was stepping back from his role as CEO. The move sent ripples through his industry, sparking speculation and debate, but Jason remained steadfast. He assured the board that he would remain involved in an advisory capacity but emphasized that his priorities had shifted. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom, unburdened by the relentless demands of his previous life. Dahlia watched the changes with cautious optimism. She admired Jason's courage and his willingness to embrace a different kind of life, but she also struggled to let go of her own fears. He had promised to respect her independence, and so far he had kept that promise. When he offered to invest in the cafe, it wasn't with the intention of taking over but to ensure its future and give her the flexibility to dream bigger. I want this to be yours, always, Jason said one evening as they reviewed plans to expand the cafe's outdoor seating area. I'm just here to support you. Dahlia smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. Thank you. For everything. Their partnership extended beyond the cafe. Jason became a fixture in Dahlia and Noah's lives, carving out time to be present in ways that mattered. He joined Noah in building elaborate sandcastles on the beach, cheered him on at his school's weekend soccer games, and even indulged the boy's fascination with pirate stories by helping him create a makeshift treasure map. Noah, who had been wary of Jason at first, quickly warmed to him. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, and Dahlia often found herself marveling at how naturally Jason fit into their little family. She had spent so long protecting her heart, but seeing the joy on Noah's face made her realize just how much Jason had become a part of their lives. One afternoon, as the three of them sat on the beach watching the waves, Noah turned to Jason with a serious expression. Are you going to stay? He asked, his voice small but filled with hope. Jason looked at the boy, his heart tightening. Yes, Noah. I'm staying. The answer seemed to satisfy Noah, who leaned against Jason's side with a contented sigh. Dahlia, watching the exchange, felt a lump rise in her throat. For so long, she had carried the weight of being both mother and father to Noah, but in Jason, she had found someone who shared that weight willingly. As summer turned to autumn, the changes in their lives became more evident. The cafe thrived with its modest expansion, drawing more visitors while maintaining its cozy charm. Jason, now a familiar face in Seabreeze Bay, had won over many of the locals who had once doubted him. His willingness to roll up his sleeves and pitch in, whether it was repairing a creaky porch swing or helping organize the town's fall festival, earned him respect and even a few friendships. The festival, held on a crisp October evening, was the culmination of months of growth and healing for Jason, Dahlia, and Noah. The cafe had taken on a central role in the event, its patio adorned with strings of lights and tables laden with homemade treats. Music drifted through the air as neighbors gathered to celebrate, their laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. Dahlia moved through the crowd, her smile warm and genuine as she greeted familiar faces. She wore a simple dress that fluttered in the breeze, her hair loosely pinned back. Jason watched her from across the patio, his heart swelling with pride and affection. She was radiant, and he felt an overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. As the evening wore on, the band began to play a slower tune, and couples drifted onto the makeshift dance floor. Jason crossed the patio to where Dahlia stood, her gaze fixed on the twinkling lights overhead. "Dance with me?" he asked, holding out his hand. Dahlia turned to him, her smile soft. "I thought you'd never ask." They moved to the music, their steps slow and easy, as though the rest of the world had fallen away. The warmth of Jason's hand on her waist and the gentle rhythm of his movements made Dahlia feel more at peace than she had in years. "You've changed my life," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the music. Jason leaned closer, his eyes locked on hers. "And you've given mine meaning." Around them, the townspeople watched with a mixture of admiration and acceptance. The man they had once seen as an outsider had become one of them, not through wealth or charm but through his genuine love for Dahlia and his commitment to the community. As the song ended, Noah ran up to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Come see the bonfire, Mom! It's huge!" Dahlia laughed, letting Jason take her hand as they followed Noah to the beach. The flames of the bonfire crackled against the night sky, illuminating the faces of the crowd gathered around it. Noah found a group of friends and darted off, leaving Dahlia and Jason standing side by side. "This feels like home," Jason said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Dahlia looked at him, her heart full. "It is home. For all of us." Jason slipped his arm around her, pulling her close as they watched the firelight dance on the water. In that moment, surrounded by warmth and love, they both knew they had found something rare and precious. Their journey had been far from easy, but it had brought them to a place where they could truly begin again, together. As the flames of the bonfire flicker and fade, so too does the story of Jason and Dahlia reach its heartwarming conclusion. It's a tale of love that defied expectations, of two people from different worlds finding common ground and building a life rooted in trust, growth, and the courage to embrace change. Their journey reminds us that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It's about the willingness to show up, to fight for what matters, and to create a life that honors both individuality and connection. In the end, it's not the headlines, the wealth, or the opinions of others that define us. It's the choices we make and the people we choose to share our hearts with. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, redemption, and the power of love, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspiring tales. Let us know in the comments, what's the biggest lesson you've learned about love and connection? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.